I do think for Cape Ann, it was largely inclusion in a sense by gender for women. And there, single women felt comfortable and were supported, as you saw in that early slide of Teresa Bernstein's community of the New England ladies that supported her. And for instance, Ellen Day Hale often let others use her printing press that was there out on her property. And so that was another important kind of community aspect. So I would just say that inclusiveness might be thought of that way. And also in terms of how artists exhibited their work because of these organizations, these artists organizations on Cape Ann that enabled amateurs working as well as professional artists who chose to exhibit there with two different artist organizations, one with a jury and one with not.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society, ably produced by GBH Forum Network. Tonight, we're also in partnership with the Cape Ann Museum and the Provincetown Art Association and Museum. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, NEHGS, and producer of this author series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, American art, and cultural history. On your screen is the schedule for tonight's event centered on two books and two authors, John Taylor Ike Williams and his book, The Shores of Bohemia, just out in paperback, and Elliot Bostwick Davis, guest curator and author of Edward Hopper and Cape Ann, the book accompanying the Cape Ann Museum exhibition. John Taylor Ike Williams is a founder of the literary agency Needham and Williams and a lawyer specializing in intellectual property and First Amendment litigation. He is the co-author of the widely used textbook Pearl, Williams, and Fisher on Publishing Law. Among his other positions, Mr. Williams has served as chair of the National Endowment for the Arts Award panel and as a trustee of the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston and of the Fine Arts Works Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Elliot Bostwick Davis has formerly served as curator of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the John Morris Cabot Chair at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and director of the Norton Museum. She's published extensively on American art, from Winslow Homer to Mary Cassatt to Jamie Wyeth. She is also guest curator for the exhibition Edward Hopper and Cape Ann, Illuminating an American Landscape, on view at the Cape Ann Museum in Gloucester, Massachusetts through October 16. It's gotten remarkable reviews in the Boston Globe and in the Washington Post. We'll hear from Dr. Davis in a moment, but to start us off, welcome, Ike Taylor. It is such an honor to have you with us. I've loved your book for some time now, and I was not at all surprised when it landed, gaining high marks on the New Yorker and also landed on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. It is really delightful summer reading. Congratulations, Ike, now on the paperback edition coming out just a couple of weeks ago. Lucky for me, as you know, I was in Truro and Wellfleet over the weekend, and I'm delighted you'll be taking all of us back there now and back through time. It's really an honor to have you. Over to you, Ike.
Good evening, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I was so happy when you called to propose this sort of exploration of the two capes in Massachusetts. One, because I'd heard Elliot give a brilliant talk some time ago on the Wyeth family, and I was totally enchanted with the way she approached them. And then, of course, she has this beautiful show now up at the Cape Ann Museum on Jo Nivison and her husband, Ed Hopper. We now give Jo first billing, I think Elliot will too. And so it's just a delight to be with you. I'm going to open by talking about sort of a tale of two capes since I grew up on one. I spent most of my summers on Cape Ann in various parts. My grandfather and father lived in Annisquam, and then we moved to Gloucester and Rockport. near the quarries where Paul Manship, the great American sculptor, sort of drew all kinds of young artists to come to Gloucester and work with these Finnish quarrymen. My neighbors then, as growing up, were George Demetrius, another great sculptor who was a friend of, sort of apprentice to Paul as a youth, and Virginia Lee Burton, the author of so many children's books, many of you know well, The Little Engine That Could, and things like that, was a neighbor. And so it was an artist colony that I got to know, particularly painters, and there were marine painters everywhere, John Worth being one of the leading ones. And of course, it was a fishing village. And it had this mixed tradition of Yankee boats and Italian boats, oddly enough, each going to their own churches and having their own crews and their own celebrations. Kipling's Captains Courageous, of course, is set in Gloucester in that turn of the century period. Motif number 1 was a favorite place for so many of those marine painters to focus on. And then right up through the movie that many of you have seen, Perfect Storm, which again, shows you that fishing village still exists as a real fishing village. And so it sort of shaped my feeling about artists and the work they did and how they approached it. But that world I left behind when I went a courting as a young man for my wife, who was a painter and the daughter of a painter and architect who lived at the other Cape, which I'm really concentrating on, at Provincetown. And unlike Gloucester, where the stone was left in these huge piles of original rock, the Cape is just that same rock pounded to death by the Wisconsin glacier as it crossed North America, hit the sea, and formed what archaeologists, geologists call a tombolo, which is all of the debris of gravel and sand that the glacier has ground up and then spilled and then shaped by the ocean as it shapes it and meets it. And at the very end of this tombolo is a curve, and that is the harbor of Provincetown. And my book concentrates on these 3 harbor towns that start in Provincetown, move to Truro, and then to Wellfleet. They're very narrow. So in the high points of the land, you can see the ocean on one side and the bay on the other. Now it's much more heavily forested than it was when my book opens in 1910. And I'm covering a 50-year period, unlike Elliot, who's really concentrating on 2 painters in a short period of time and their work in Gloucester. I'm covering a period of 50 years of a great many artists as Provincetown became a kind of utopian center for artists from all over the country. And the reason they were drawn there over and above the light, which everyone will discuss who's ever been to Provincetown, which drew so many painters, was a political spine that ran through this 50-year period in which all of these artists, painters, writers, architects, all believed in a very different America than the America that they emerged in 1910. The Civil War has left America in the hands of, very much like today, about 5% of Americans control most of the wealth. And the working men worked a 10-hour day, 6 days a week, women and children. And these people had a commonality about feeling that America had a duty to do better than it was doing, both for working people, men, women, and children, but also for the allocation of wealth and the inclusion of other people being women. Women, of course, in 1910 had to wait another 29 years for the vote. Blacks had no votes. Enormous amount of anti-Semitism in that period because it was the height of the great Jewish immigrations from the Pale, starting around 1900 moving into the beginning of the First World War. So it was a very a utopian kind of a group, in the sense that, unlike other painting colonies, its nexus was politics, and everybody who came there was bound by that, and that politics led to an enormous amount of emphasis on the rights of women. Margaret Sanger came to Provincetown every summer. Her birth control advocates followed her. Emma Goldman, the great spokesperson for women labor unions. This was a hotbed of feminist politics, as well as the center of the journalists who were then writing what we called muckraking, sort of exposing corporate America's treatment of its workers. John Reed, actually, if a nice way to approach that period of 1929 again is to see, if you've not seen it, the movie Reds, which opens just about this period in Provincetown. John Reed is there with his lover, Louise Bryant, and she is also having an affair with his friend, Eugene O'Neill. The three of them were there in Provincetown, each doing their work. O'Neill beginning his great series of plays, Bryant beginning to be a journalist of first rate, and Reed beginning to be probably the most radical writer of in America at that point for the masses, which almost all the editors spent their summers in Provincetown. So it's a different thing than Cape Ann in the sense that without this political bond which they form, it wouldn't have become so utopian, where you watch these people move through American history in time from 1910 as Teddy Roosevelt, progressive, supporting labor, to Eugene Debs' socialism, opposing America's entry into the First World War, to 1919, the creation of the American Communist Party, as the revolution occurs in Russia, and then to liberalism up through 1960 and the election of John Kennedy. And through all of this, politics is what binds these people. The artistic colony is based around two great painting schools. Charles Hawthorne, who's born in Maine, very interested in sort of the beginning of American Impressionism, becomes a teacher on Long Island of plein air, always working outdoors whenever the weather permits it. Opens his school in 1909 in Provincetown, and it is the most successful American sort of impressionist painting school until 1934, when he turns over the keys to Hans Hoffman. And he's influenced, particularly as most American painters were that period, who were exploring modernism by the 1913 Armory Show, in which many of these people had work in the 1913 Armory Show in New York. And there were 1,000 paintings, divided half with the new European painters whom people had not seen in America, Picasso and Cubist painting, Rousseau, and then the so-called Ashcan realist school in America, who were supporting real life in America. So John Sloan, Robert Henry, the plight of the working class in some ways. So it was a very tumultuous period in the painting world. And particularly, it drew painters who were interested in color more than representation. And that moves into Hans Hoffman coming to America to escape the Nazis, who's closed down his painting school in Bavaria, and opening his school in Provincetown in 1934. And it is the beginning of American abstract expressionism. I don't think there is an abstract expressionist who didn't study or teach with Hans. He was an amazing figure. We'll take a look at him and some of these painters in a moment. So that's the setting, very political, very dedicated to a new exploration of American thought, whether it's playwriting like O'Neill or painting like Hawthorne and Hoffman. Writers who are really interested in the American story, John Dos Passos, Edmund Wilson, Mary McCarthy. And of course, it turns out in 1933, with the election of Hitler in Germany, we suddenly get probably the largest diaspora of talent in the world from Nazi Germany. And many of them are the architects of the Bauhaus who followed Walter Gropius to Cambridge and then settle on the Cape in these towns, particularly Truro. So we've got all these various artistic people, Tennessee Williams, Frank O'Hara, Mary Oliver, many, many gay, creative people, all of them politically bound up in this sort of search for kind of a utopian America that would result in what they hoped was a much more Athenian kind of democratic, equal democracy with a small d. So let's turn to the slides and we'll take a little look at some of these painters. Here's the cover of the book. That's a beach painting by Paul Resick. It's actually behind me here. And on that beach is Jack Phillips, who gave a lot of the land that he had inherited. His family were the founders of both Phillips Academy, Exeter and Andover. And he had taken his inheritance, which consisted of about 300 acres of what was thought to be useless mosquito-ridden swamps and ponds in Wellfleet and Truro, and turned it into this great center for Bohemian and architects to build their new houses and painters to find cheap land to buy and paint in. So this is a painting by one of his son-in-laws, Paul Reska, who was also a young apprentice to Hans Hoffman. And at that are, not that you can identify them, but many of the kind of bohemians of that period of the 50s and 60s. Serge Shemaev, a famous architect who'd come over with Gropius. The Phillips family had married into all kinds of other interesting families. So amongst them, one of his daughters had been married to Martin Amis. Martin's in that painting, as well as his best friend, Christopher Hitchens. So it's a very kind of symbolic painting of that period in Cape, and so it appealed to me as a cover. The next one is Boundbrook Island, which is the center of sort of part of my story, which is when I went according to seek. My wife and I met her father, John Hughes Hall, or Jack Hall. He, in 1937, had bought most of this island from John Dos Passos' wife. John was in Spain with Hemingway making a movie for the Civil War, the Spanish side of the Civil War. And so he buys this island in 1937, and this becomes the center of a good deal of this book. The next slide, that is the feeling of Provincetown, probably from 1910 to the late 20s. This is 1928. This is Hoffman teaching plein air on the beach. And you'll notice how many women there are in his classes. They were almost all half women. He was very encouraging of women. And that, you can see what Provincetown looked like in those days. It was wharf after wharf after wharf, but the whaling and cod fishing was almost gone. And so these were empty wharf buildings and fish houses. And so there was very cheap rental places for painters to rent, starting right from 1910 on. Let's go to the next one. So, and this is a very important one because it's the end of Prohibition in 1933 in Greenwich Village. And most Bohemians, I don't care whether they're architects, painters, writers, viewed alcohol as a muse, much to the destruction of many of their careers. Eugene O'Neill was an admitted alcoholic, but he refused to ever drink while he was writing. And he was one of the few who was able to impose that kind of discipline on himself. But it was a very part of this much more freedom of sexuality, much more liquor, much more political activity. This was the atmosphere in which these people thrived. Next slide. There's John Hughes Hull, my father-in-law, just out of Princeton. He'd bought this land and come down as a sort of a kid out of with 2 Rolls Royces and a polo pony. And for some reason, he'd fallen deeply in love with the left in America. And on his vegetable stand, as he created a garden on this island, he had a sign that said, "No Trotskyites," he having become an ardent Stalinist at that point. And he remained to the left all the time I knew him. Very complex guy. He gave up alcohol, which was very destructive for him. Was in AA for the rest of his life. Became a Quaker, very active in Friends Service. Opened the Friends Service office in Zimbabwe after Zimbabwe became independent. Was beaten and jailed with Martin Luther King at Selma. And the next slide will show the end of his great trip through the leftist artistic world was this building called the Hatch House, which is considered by most modern architects to be one of the great innovative architectural houses in the sort of modern architecture. Highly influenced by Bauhaus architects, but unusual in itself. And we're looking out across the bay towards Provincetown. And the next slide. Here's Hans Hoffman at work in his classes. They were always filled. He drew every person you can think of who became an abstract expressionist. Mark Rothko, Adam Gottlieb, just everybody worked with him. Frankenfeller, Motherwell. Jackson Pollock. So let's keep going. We'll see some of the students. Here, Annie and Josef Albers. You know Albers probably from his square colored paintings, but he came from the Brauhaus where he was an instructor in Gropius's Bauhaus and head of the painting, as was his wife to the left, who was the head of the textile department. She was Jewish, so they had to flee, as most of them did, for their lives. And here they're arriving by boat in 1933, and they've been given a job at Black Mountain College in North Carolina. It's just opened. Next one. Here's Helen Frankenthaler at work in 1959. She did some of her great work there. Clement Greenberg was not only her lover, but a great supporter of hers, the first major critic of so-called abstract expressionism. And she was married to Robert Motherwell during this period, and both of them had an enormous output of wonderful work coming out of Provincetown during that marriage. Next one. Here's Jackson Pollock at work. He's at the Springs in Long Island, but he began as his first painting was encouraged by Hans Hoffman to do these splatter paintings, which he explored with Max Ernst, who was then living with Peggy Guggenheim, and they were renting down at the Cape. So he was brought there by Lee Krasner, who later married him. She brought a lot of people to study with Hans Hoffman, particularly Jackson, but also people like Arshile Gorky, a number of other formative abstract expressionists. Next. Well, here's somebody you're going to hear a great deal more from Elliot. Here's Edward Hopper in his studio. The interesting thing about Ed in his studio is he built this one for himself and nothing for his wife, an equally good painter in many ways, but she painted in the kitchen. And this is his new studio in Truro. Next. And this is the last one. And this is a self-portrait of Edward Dickinson, who many consider one of the greatest painters to come out of this period in Provincetown. He was a bit of a maverick. He came to study with Hawthorne, but he quickly went off on his own because he was really interested in exploring a new kind of expressionism, but not abstract, but quite abstract. And his work, I think, is going to stand the test of time as much as Hopper's or anyone else's. That gives you sort of feeling, I hope, a little about the period I'm writing about in those 50 years. in Provincetown. But now I want to go back and let's look at the other Cape. And Elliot Davis is going to take us to Gloucester, and Joe Nivenson and Edward Hopper.
Great to be with you, everyone. Thank you, Ike, such a distinguished author and dear friend, and Margaret, everyone at our painting partner institutions, all of the artists and painters on as well. I'm sure there are many tonight. It's a joy to be with all of you this evening. So here we are. We're going to take a look, Andrew, at our first slide, if we could, and the beginnings of the art colony on Cape Ann. And could we go ahead one, Andrew, please? We'll take a look at John Sloan, who was painting there at the upper left from Rocky Neck, where many of the artists lived. And of course, this colony on Cape Ann, as Ike alluded to, had gone back to the early 19th century with the local artist, Fitzhenry Lane, who painted luminous marine scenes. And in 1873, the Winslow Homer, of course, had his breakthrough summer with watercolor. And it was something that Edward Hopper certainly would have known when he arrived in Gloucester. But and you see there on the left with John Sloan, who Ike mentioned, but he was there for many summers with his wife, Dolly. They lived in the Red Cottage and welcomed many people. But he was the one who famously quipped that there were so many artists in Gloucester that the cows were dying from eating paint rags. So on the right, we have two other artists, a husband and wife duo, although when she first arrived at the upper right, Teresa Bernstein arrived in 1916 as a single woman, and she felt very comfortable there on Cape Ann, supported by a network of women she's painted here in her painting, New England Ladies. Two of the anchors of that group were Cecilia Beau, one of the early admits to the National Academy of Design, and Ellen Day Hale, whose brother was the influential Philip Hale, head of painting at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. Teresa Bernstein married William Meyerowitz, who painted the scene of Gloucester in 1923 when the Hoppers arrived there independently. And you see him painting the scene at the lower right center. And he's painting the independent artists organizations that existed in Gloucester, which were also attractive to others as a colony because it allowed artists who were amateurs as well as professionals to participate without juries, and that was very important to them. In this scene, if you look carefully at nearly the lower left corner, you'll see Teresa Bernstein painting, and another artist just below center, wearing +4s, the short breeches. That's Stuart Davis, who often stayed with Teresa Bernstein and William Meyerowitz. All right, let's go to the next, please, Andrew. So our discussion tonight is about Edward Hopper and Joe Nivenson Hopper, who meet in Gloucester in 1923, although they knew each other as students at the New York School of Art. And just to remind you, Edward Hopper grew up in Nyack, New York. It's located on the banks of the Hudson River, just about an hour north of New York City. And his only painting sale when he arrived in Gloucester in 1923 was of a sailboat. And he had made that sale 10 years earlier at the Armory Show of 1913. But and you see here on the right, as a young boy, his painting those sailboats that were floating by his window on the Hudson, where he could see them. He also built himself a small catboat. But I love the fact that his mother also made watercolors and drawings for her own pleasure, as did Winslow Homer's mother. And so here he's creating an early watercolor. At the left, this is a beautiful chalk drawing. It's in the exhibition. It's of the Henry Ford. This was a fishing schooner. It was built in nearby Essex, Massachusetts, and it was intended to be the hometown favorite to win the important International Fisherman's Cup race and the Lipton Cup, which it did win that summer, which she did win, competing against the Canadian schooners that had challenged them initially. And this was one of the subjects that then Edward Hopper rendered as an etching, because at that point in 1923, with the lack of painting sales, he was still supporting himself through popular magazine illustration and making prints. And Andrew, let's go to the next one. In 1923, his life was about to change dramatically when he was there and fell in love with this woman, Joe Nivenson Hopper. She's shown in the full-length portrait. Actually, all of these works are in the show. This work in the center, painted by Edward Hopper and Joe Nivenson's shared teacher, Robert Henry. And Joe Nivenson was born in New York City. Her father was a musician. her mother a homemaker, and they supported her dream of becoming a painter. And on her way to doing that, she secured a degree from the Normal College, now Hunter College of New York, so she could teach art in the public schools. And after she graduated at 22, as she is here in this portrait in the middle, she decided that she would attend the foremost art classes offered in New York City at the New York School of Art by Robert Henri, who essentially shows her as the quintessential art student. The work traveled throughout the US and it even appeared on the New York City paper. So it'd be very hard for somebody like Edward Hopper to miss that. On the right, you see her at about 53 when she was married to Edward Hopper, and at the left at about 73. This work we're thrilled to have in the show from our partners at the Provincetown Art Association and Museum. Let's go ahead, Andrew, one more. So let's take a look at what Edward Hopper was working on before he met Jo Nivison. And in a way, he really is struggling to find his style at the recommendation of Robert Henri, who suggested that the students get away from New York City to summer art colonies. Here he is on Monhegan, Maine. It's about 10 miles off the coast from Booth Bay Harbor or Rockland. And you see him on these small panels painting the sea and the rocks and the water and the houses. Well, of course, there are a lot of houses on Monhegan, but he's not terribly interested in them. Now, let's go ahead, Andrew. We'll take a look at when he first arrives in Gloucester. It's before he meets Jo Nivison there in 1923. He arrives in 1912 at the invitation of fellow artist and contemporary Leon Kroll. And it's then that he paints his first outdoor oil painting in the United States. It's this work of Briar Neck at Gloucester. He, of course, had painted out of doors abroad, mostly in Paris, where he traveled briefly in 1906, 1909, and 1910. And let's go ahead one more, Andrew. Here's another house that caught his eye, this brilliant acid green house in the Italian Quarter that he rendered in oil, again, painting out of doors. Now, let's take a look what happens in the next slide. As they paint together in 1923. As the story goes, Jo arrived in Gloucester with her beloved tabby cat, Arthur, who went missing on the back streets of Gloucester, and was spotted by Edward Hopper, who delivered Arthur back to Jo with a note including a hand-drawn map of the painting sites in Gloucester and how to get there. And he invited her to join him on outdoor painting excursions. In the mornings, he said he would signal their departure with a pebble tossed at her window in the room that she shared with an unnamed female roommate. So off they went, and soon thereafter, Jo Nivison suggested that he try her favorite medium, which was watercolor. Edward Hopper had occasionally used watercolor for his illustrations, but not for anything like these outdoor landscapes painted in front of the subjects themselves. Now, the scene they're painting here together is the very beloved Portuguese church, the center of the Portuguese community on Cape Ann. It's a landmark you can still see today. And note how their temperaments come through in this scene. He's using the horizontal, she's using the vertical, and focusing on that expressive force of the Madonna holding the fishing schooner at the center, whereas Edward Hopper is very much capturing the towers within that architectural setting of the fence and the building. And we'll go ahead to the next slide. Well, that summer, he also paints this house on Rocky Neck where many of the artists lived, and you'll hear about it in the reading later. But it was one of the great watercolors of that summer. The summer ends, Jo Nivison and Edward Hopper return to their respective apartments in New York City's Greenwich Village, and she advocates to the curators of the Brooklyn Museum, where 12 of her works have already been selected for exhibition in November at the prestigious biennial for watercolor. She suggests to the curators that they include Edward Hopper's watercolors, and they do. They include this one, The Mansard Roof. It's exhibited there at the Brooklyn Museum. It gets a rave review by a critic who was also a teacher of Robert Henri, Helen Appleton Reed, and the Brooklyn Museum acquires it for $100 for their permanent collection, where it is coming to the exhibition, marking only the second painting sale that Edward Hopper has made at the age of 41. So with that, he's off on an exciting career trajectory. And let's take a look at the next slide. The summer of 24 rolls around and the painting holiday discussion ensues. And it turns out Edward Hopper would like to return to Gloucester, but Jo Nivison wants to go back to the other Cape. She'd actually spent time in Provincetown. She was a member of the Washington Square Players, a theatrical group in New York City, and had been out at Provincetown in 1915 and 22. Well, an argument ensues, and she decides that she will go to Gloucester under one condition, that she and Edward are married that day, July 9, 1924, and they are married in return. I like to think of this as her one of their marriage portraits. You see her on the Good Harbor Beach working on probably a watercolor sketch, but you don't know it's Jo except for the title under that brilliant hat. But you do know that Edward Hopper is very much on the same level as she is at the beach. And let's look at another image of the next slide, where we see another famous artistic couple who also married in 1924, that October. Here is Georgia O'Keeffe, photographed by her husband, Alfred Stieglitz. At this point in 1918, they're having an affair. They're staying in the Adirondacks, where Stieglitz was joined by his wife and daughter. And you see how Georgia O'Keeffe is really carefully fitted into that scene, whereas Jo is really stretched out there on Good Harbor Beach. And let's go ahead, Andrew. We're going to move through some of these a little bit quickly. A side of Hopper, I think, that we don't see is this brilliant sand of Cape Anne's famous beaches. Here on the left of the Bass Rocks Beach, where they remembered both falling in love. And this work on the right, it's in oil. And yet I think we can assume it's the same yellow and red beach umbrellas, but how differently. Jo's very interested in the overall pattern of this tumble of sketchy figures and brilliant umbrellas across her vertical composition. And let's go ahead again, Andrew, please. Their shared teacher, Robert Henry, suggested that they paint what they love in the manner of the sketch hunter, modeled in many ways on the 19th century flaneur that Charles Baudelaire described, wandering the city and landing on, in Henry's terms, what they wanted to get to know better. And it turned out for both Edward and Jo Hopper, those trawlers in Gloucester pulled up to the wharves and moored at the wharves were something that caught both of their eyes. These two scenes really take on certain anthropomorphic qualities of personality. And it's fascinating to see how, again, they're using their characteristic handling of the watercolor, Jo much more spontaneous, and of course the vertical, and Edward Hopper expressing this sense of contentment there with his two trawlers tied up together. Let's go ahead. One of the great documents that survives at the Cape Ann Museum is this one from 1926. The Hoppers returned to Cape Ann again for the second half of the summer of 26. And in August, on August 30th, that last line of the register was signed by Josephine Hopper, New York. She walked into the building, which is now at the present day site of the Cape Ann Museum, and signed the book because it was a museum she was probably interested in seeing, but also very close to where they were staying on Middle Street. And let's go ahead, Andrew, please. This is the summer that Edward Hopper is going to paint some of his most famous house portraits, including these two. Anderson's house, painted probably soon after they arrived, around July, and on the right, on a much colder day in October. And we know that because Jo Nivison, after their marriage, in addition to becoming the sole model for Edward Hopper, began keeping careful records of his work, including where the works were exhibited, what they sold for, and where they ended up over time. And let's go ahead, please. He also painted a scene of Gloucester Harbor, which was unusual for him. He usually had his back to the water. This one, very much a nod to the earlier 19th century painter Fitzhenry Lane from Gloucester. But take a look at the center of the composition there on the horizon, where you see the lighthouse keeper's residence and the lighthouse, because the following summer of 27, his work would have become so successful that with the sales of his watercolors in Gloucester, the Hoppers were able to afford a car. And the summer of 27, they leave to head further north to Portland and Cape Elizabeth, where he paints the famous scenes of lighthouses. And let's go ahead again, please. Here we are with them back in Gloucester in 1928. Painting side by side. I think you can see that with these watercolors, with the fence there, the fence around the steps right near the Cape Ann Museum. You can still traverse them today and see this building with the cupola there that's quite square with the dormers. It still survives. So I think that's another aspect of this, this experience of the importance of place, that you can actually walk in the footsteps of Edward and Jo Hopper in Gloucester. And let's go ahead, please, Andrew. We're going to talk about this one in the reading, but they both head out to the circus grounds at Stageford Park in Gloucester and paint these two scenes. And next, please. The final three oils, as Edward Hopper is completing this 5 summers on Cape Ann, he paints 3 major oils out of doors. And I think they are incredibly crisp. And we can't even imagine that Edward Hopper could have painted these when we think back to the earlier Monhegan panels that I showed you at the outset. But here he is painting the modernization of Gloucester as he's experienced it over 16 years from 1912 when he first visited to now in 1928, and the impact of modern transportation, including obviously the railroad that was transporting the fish that was being caught on the wharves throughout the nation and further even abroad. And the next, please. This is his statement about the boulders that he absolutely adored on Cape Ann. In fact, he said later on in 1930, when the Hoppers moved on to Cape Cod and began renting before they built their own house that Ike alluded to, he was fascinated by these boulders, and he loved the early light of morning and the late night of day, later night of evening, and I think captured it beautifully here in Cape Ann granite. And the final one is of his final statement of all of the houses perhaps that he's painted over time. It seemed to emerge in this portrait of Hodgkin's house. It's the only oil portrait he paints on Cape Ann since the earlier one of the Italian Quarter, the house in the Italian Quarter, that brilliant green. He said in his older age that he only wanted to paint sunlight on the side of the house, on the side of a house. And here he did brilliantly in Hodgkin's house. And I like to think of these 3 as really in many ways, his final triptych of all the aspects of Cape Ann. And let's take a look at the last slide. Here in 1928, he's going to produce a watercolor on the left of Prospect Street. It's a street just a block and a half as you leave the Cape Ann Museum and you look to your right as you head towards Prospect Street, you'll see this scene. And in a way, instead of a single house, Edward Hopper is here really representing the community of Gloucester that he and his wife, Jo Nivison Hopper, have gotten to know. You see the styles of architecture that he loved, the double gable. If you look towards the, beyond the center of the composition, you'll see the curve of the mansard roof. And in the far distance, the towers of Our Lady of Good Voyage. And along the curb in each direction, automobiles, of course, demonstrating and reminding us of the modernization of Cape Ann. And they were often featured the numerous automobile accidents that were caused by cars racing around Cape Ann's narrow streets were noted on the front page of the Gloucester Daily Times. So in 1933, Edward Hopper is honored by having a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. He was only the 3rd American artist so honored. And in the opening of the catalog, the curator and director, Alfred Barr, notes the dramatic transformation of Edward Hopper in the previous decade. And he describes how he was transformed into an incredible painter of distinctly American architecture, and how this happened was really a mystery. There's really no mention whatsoever of Jo Nivison Hopper's role in that transformation. And he gets rave reviews from the exhibition, except for one colleague who had known and shown with him earlier on, and said that he wasn't keeping step with abstraction and modernism. And it's then that he paints this final memory of Gloucester in his New York City studio. You see here on the right, the sun on Prospect Street in oil. It was originally acquired by the actor Edward Robinson, and for his collection is now in Cincinnati. We're thrilled it's in the show, but in many ways, it's going to be the last statement of his work there on Cape Ann, and yet the many motifs and the many lessons learned side by side with Jo will continue on till the end of his career as she continues to play the role of his very accomplished producer. And with that, I just want to thank you. We have one slide just with all of our digital credits. And I think we will take some questions from our audience from earlier, and any that may come up in the chat. So thank you all, and Ike will come back for some questions. So one of our members of the audience today had asked about what was the book that Ike has been most jealous of, or if we put it another way, what were the books that really inspired you, Ike, to write this amazingly and beautifully written, but also award-winning Shores of Bohemia?
Well, first it was just to record a vanishing species, I guess, because when I first encountered these people, they were a whole new world to me. I mean, I came from quite a conservative political family that were not particularly interested in the arts. And so this was a world that was quite amazing to me. But I realized even then, when I first encountered it in 1967, that people were dying off. And while there were wonderful biographies of people like Edmund Wilson or Mary McCarthy or Eugene O'Neill, there wasn't a group portrait of how these people came together and stayed together for such a long period of time through all these different vicissitudes in American life. And so I got interested in sort of recording these stories as people told me them, or I read them, and trying to put them together sort of like a puzzle. But there were two books that I think impressed me. One was The Big House, which some of you may have read about, sort of the beginning of a family's old sort of summer house, not this, a little further up on the Cape, sort of. But the same period of time, and as the families sort of, the generations rise and fall in this house, and many of you have read it. I thought it was a brilliant picture of a period of time. And Mr. Colt, the author, introduces you to everything about the land around the house, the history of the Native Americans who were first there, the geology of it, the maritime history of it, and yet it's still about this family. And the other house, the other book, was The Zookeeper's Wife, which is a true story of the couple who, he was the director of the zoo in Warsaw as the Germans took Poland. And they became the center for partisan life, smuggling Jews out of the Polish ghetto, which was then sealed off, smuggling them off at night into the zoo, into the empty cages, because Hitler had commanded that all of the great zoos in Europe give the very best specimens to Germany. So there were all these empty cages, and the people would be hidden there at night. But it also, again, was a small story about a small period in history, but it was a huge period, even though it just grew out of this one family trying to survive and help others survive. So those were the two books I think influenced me the most, Elliot. No.
That's great. And I think we talked earlier about, what makes a creative community. We can certainly come back to that, but I think you highlighted that at the outset in the qualities of light, which I think both of these capes shared, their politics and the working aspects of these communities as well. From our audience, there came some very interesting questions about how welcoming and inclusive were these capes to artists of color and Indigenous artists. And there, as I reflected upon this, of course, on both capes, the Indigenous populations had been there centuries earlier, as Ike alluded to as well. But I think the foremost community was really on Martha's Vineyard at Oak Bluffs, which I really worked on a bit myself when I was working on the Boston-born artist Lois Mailou Jones, who spent her summers working in the community on Oak Bluffs, who was a graduate of the SMFA and taught at Howard for 47 years, and also worked in Haiti as well. Her husband later was Haitian. And if we think of inclusiveness, and I'll turn this back to you in a moment, I do think for Cape Ann, it was largely inclusion in a sense by gender for women. And there, single women felt comfortable and were supported, as you saw in that early slide of Teresa Bernstein's community of the New England ladies that supported her. And for instance, Ellen Day Hale often let others use her printing press that was there on her property. And so that was another important kind of community aspect. So I would just say that inclusiveness might be thought of that way. And also in terms of how artists exhibited their work, because of these organizations, these artists organizations on Cape Ann that enabled amateurs working as well as professional artists who chose to exhibit there with two different artists organizations, one with a jury and one with not. So I'm happy to turn it over to you, Ike, to add further color on the visual artists. I know we've been talking a lot about visual artists and largely painters. We'll come to sculptors in a minute, but I'm happy to hear about any other writers, musicians, and of course, dancers. They're all involved in these communities.
I think particularly about Provincetown was, it was a naval base in both the First and Second World War. So like all port cities, particularly that have sailors and bars, they're pretty tolerant cities, whether it's Marseille or San Diego or Key West. So from the very beginning of that period, in the First World War on, it does what I think tolerant seaports do. It's very comfortable for people who are not comfortable other places. And so Provincetown early on drew bohemians. That's, of course, the subject of my tract here. And bohemians in that period really wanted America to be what it had been. And so the idea of a working class place that survived only by work in the sea, nobody earning money other than just to survive, was the America that they, of course it's utopian, but that's the America they wanted to return to, where your work was much more important than the money. And so that drew those kinds of people, particularly, remember, we're talking about the so-called modern woman. A modern woman wants the same rights as men have about a romantic life, a career, equal treatment in every way, including the vote in this period. So it drew all kinds of women, gay and straight, very early on, because again, it was a port city. So both male and female artists who were gay felt very comfortable there from right from the beginning. And the Portuguese community, while deeply Catholic, was very tolerant of this rising gay community, particularly in renting property and forming housing for them where the Yankee families wouldn't rent. So it had that wonderful quality of a tolerant port city. And I think that drew Greenwich Village was becoming overcome as a tourist place, even by the time I opened up in 1910. People came to, quote, see the Bohemians. And so Floyd Dell, who was the head of the Masses magazine, referred to Provincetown as Greenwich Village sunburn. And that's, everybody went there for the summer because it was so cheap and so comfortable. And then as they began to find out that they could create more work there than they could in New York, they'd stay on for longer periods of time. I mean, Hans Hoffman ran his school 7 months a year in Provincetown. Mm-hmm. Norman Mailer wrote almost all his books there. O'Neill, most of his great plays there. So it was a place where once you got there, if you could make a living as an artist, you often stayed for long periods of time.
Mm-hmm. Great. We also, thank you, Ike. We also had some great questions about other artist colonies. And of course, there are artist colonies throughout New England and New York State and the Mid-Atlantic, and resources for those. We're going to hear from our two director partners in a moment, Chris McCarthy and Oliver Barker. And those institutions are certainly great resources. I was just going to mention, and someone asked about crossovers of communities as well. And museums, keep an eye on a number of those museums because often they are going to devote shows to that topic. So for instance, Cape Ann Museum recently mounted an exhibition about artists who were working both on Monhegan Island in Maine and on Cape Ann. And the Portland Museum in Maine in the past has mounted an exhibition about artists working in Maine, as well as on the Connecticut coast around Cos Cob. So there are, of course, artists, communities in all of the New England states. It's just that here we happen to be focusing in on the Bay State and these two capes on the Bay State. There was a great question about Cape Ann sculptors, specifically naming Paul Manship and Graf Barclay and Walker Hancock, who was, of course, one of the famous monuments men. He was also responsible for saving that Madonna I showed on the front of the Our Lady of Good Voyage Church, carved by Antonio Luardi. It's at the Cape Ann Museum. But there were also many distinguished women sculptors on Cape Ann, Anna Hyatt Huntington and Catherine Lane Weems, to name two. And I was just going to, the question was about how much interaction they had. And I think they're often the sculptors and artists were married. We can't forget also the those who made works on paper, prints, or textiles, like the Folly Cove designers on Cape Ann. And for instance, Virginia Lee Burton married George Demetrios, the sculptor. And I know they were close relatives, close friends and neighbors of yours in the early years, as I understand.
Mm-hmm.
We also heard about an artist named Amelia Watson, and she worked on Cape Cod, inspired by Henry David Thoreau's book about the Cape, which was interesting. And someone asked about where to find out more about her, and I didn't know much about her, but her work apparently survives in Spartanburg, South Carolina, but she trained in Connecticut, worked on Martha's Vineyard and elsewhere. And we had a question about the specific dates for the Hoppers. And I think Ike also noted that when Edward Hopper moved to Cape Cod, he said that the dunes were too soft to his liking. He loved those hard granite boulders that were on Cape Ann that you saw in that oil painting of Cape Ann granite. And the granite formed by the glacier 400 million years ago receded from the seabed, leaving those flecks of mica that contributed to that special quality of Cape Ann light. But to the specific question, Edward Hopper was on Cape Ann for 5 summers, 1912, 23, 24, 26, 28. The Hoppers together passed through after that to see friends. But in 1930, Jo got her wish in hoping to go back to Cape Cod. They rented for a couple of years, and then with an inheritance that was unexpected from Jo's uncle, were able to build the cottage on Fisher Beach near South Truro. And there they were spending summers until his death in 1967 and hers 10 months later in 68. So I think that helps answer the dates question. And then finally, Edward Hopper in teaching asked, a question came about his taking in students, and were there any students worthy of taking a look at for acquisition? Well, Edward Hopper was not, I think, well suited to teaching. Jo was the great teacher of children in the New York City public schools and often used them as subjects in The Masses, the progressive magazine edited by artist John Sloan. But he did take students briefly in Nyack, New York, before moving to New York and pursuing his career as an artist, supporting himself as an illustrator and etcher, but never later on. But if you are interested in the artists that worked around the shared teacher, Robert Henry, there are many, many artists, and many of the women artists are documented in a great book by Marion Wardle. So hope that will help you there. But of course, there are many artists who follow in their footsteps, and similarly with the teachers that were charismatic on Cape Cod, and I'm sure Ike will talk about them, like Hans Hoffman, but many, for instance, on Cape Ann, the Cape Ann Museum just recently mounted a show just before this one of the work of Jeff Weaver. And I love that 8th graders on Cape Ann were also invited to create their own windows in the manner of Hopper and show what was important to them, that their work was also on Cape Ann Museum earlier this year. But anything you'd like to add there on any of the other artists on the Cape Cod, or that the lasting influence of some of the artists, Ike, would be great.
You know, Hopper's such a difficult figure. I mean, he's not a pleasant guy. He's not a good, I mean, he's a very tough husband for Jo. I think Chris McCarthy has some of these great cartoons that they would make about each other's marriage. It was a Thurber-esque marriage, but and as far as being cut out for a teacher, I mean, he almost spoke to no one. There's a wonderful thing where John Dos Passos and Katie are having dinner with them one night. Remember, they don't drink. So you can imagine the Hoppers in my province town. I mean, it's one thing not to be an alcoholic, it's another thing not to drink at all. Neither of them drank. So they were not very good company for this heavy drinking crowd. John Dos Passos said, as they were leaving the Hoppers one night, he said to Katie, he said, I almost thought that Ed was going to say something before we left. And he took things very seriously. You were talking about the 1933 show that he finally had that made him such a success. Clement Greenberg's review of it, as you remember, said, if Hopper was not such a bad painter, he wouldn't be such a great artist. and that, of course, drove Hopper crazy.
Of course. Well, I often heard, I heard his wife say, speaking to him was like throwing a stone down a well, and that you never knew when you never would hear it drop. So I'm just going to scour with Margaret's help on our chat and see if there are any other outstanding questions I see about how well did the artistic and the local fishing communities get along. And I think the answer from what I think we have to go with much of the visual evidence, a number of the journals that Jo wrote later on. She began writing journals in 1933, but they often were memories of her earlier years on Cape Ann. She mentions being down at the wharf quite a bit. Obviously, Edward Hopper is painting in the Italian Quarter, as she is, where many of the members of the Italian Quarter were also part of the fishing community. So I have to assume that they got along quite well. In fact, Edward Hopper painted the house that is near the greenhouse, the acid green one in 1912. He paints the house on the edge there that's sort of got the ochre yellow clapboards with red trim. He paints that house in 23, and then he heads back in 1926 and paints it again when it's painted white. So he must have felt very comfortable, is my sense from the visual evidence in the Italian Quarter. Any reflections on your end of Cape Cod and the fishing community and the Bohemians, Ike?
Well, that was enormously important to everybody, the fishing community, because that was what anchored them feeling that this was a real American working community that had an ethic that was what all of these people, being very to the left, thought this was the American ethic: hard work, good work. And that was what it was about, and not about accumulating money in bad work. And so, and the fact that it was in such an incredible setting. Your Italian section of Cape Ann was, of course, our Portuguese and Azorean. We didn't have an, so there was this strong feeling of Mediterranean and Catholic life there too. I think a lot of them intermarried. A lot of artists married fishermen. My father-in-law had a fishing boat during the war, and his wife ran off with a Portuguese fisherman, my wife's mother. So there was an enormous amount of interplay between many of the artists and the fishing world. It was a real relationship. I can't imagine Edward Hopper on a boat. I don't think he ever went on a boat, did he?
Well, he apparently loved to sail with people on Cape Cod, and he tried to teach Jo. She didn't like it that he was going to be sailing on Cape Cod, but he made one of his miniature models, which he began making as a teenager when he built himself a full-scale catboat. But when Jo said on Cape Cod, he thought she should learn to sail, he made her a miniature boat to show her how the sail and the rudder would work and all the rest, and the tiller. So in any event, I don't think they got out that much because they were older, but he apparently did like to be on the water as a young boy. So we have a great question coming in the audience, which I think is more relevant for you, Ike, because you really covered the breadth of artistic talent on Cape Cod. But if you can just say a bit more about the literary community on Cape Cod, as well as, the playwrights. We know with Jo was participating in the Provincetown Players, and you discussed that in your book. And there, of course, are writers, and there's a great theater and dance and theater companies on Cape Ann, but they're not my bailiwick as much as they are yours. So I'm going to turn that over to you.
Well, I think the writers probably begin with Mary Heaton Vorse, who's a sort of comes from a nice old New England family. Her family owned the Red Lion Inn. in Stockbridge. And her parents took her to Europe as a young girl. She spoke 5 languages fluently, and she married a playboy named Albert Vorse, who was a yachtsman. And he ended up with his yacht in Provincetown Harbor. He was not interested in the arts. She became a widow with 2 small children and stayed in Provincetown, much to her family's surprise. And she became enormously interested in the American labor movement. And she became one of the great experts for 50 years on international labor. And she also lived in Greenwich Village in the winter part of the time. And she brought all her Greenwich Village pals, including all the people who were at the Masters magazine. So all the editors spent their summers there, John Sloan, all of the cartoonists and painters who worked for the magazine, and all the writers. So that was the beginning of a real writers' colony. And it was really due to her. And for 50 years, I mean, she was the sort of backbone of that bohemian writer's life. Everybody knew Mary and everybody respected her. And it was couples that she drew there who had been involved with the Washington Players, that Joe had been in Greenwich Village in the Liberal Club, who started the Provincetown Players. And the second year of which they're doing these plays, Mary Heaton Vorse's wharf. She owned a wharf with a fish house at the end that became the Playhouse. That's when O'Neill comes in on a boat with a guy he'd been a tramp steamer with. And this guy says, my friend here has a truckload of plays. And that's the first time they read the beginning of this trilogy of O'Neill's plays about the SS Glencairn. And that's the beginning of O'Neill's career as a playwright. And all the great plays are written in Provincetown over those years. And so that draws a lot of other writers. Dos Passos came there chasing his wife because they were both friends of Hemingway's. And so one person draws another. Edmund Wilson comes there because he's a friend of Dos Passos, and so on. So, and then, of course, the literary magazines of the between the wars, the Partisan Review, the New Republic, the Nation, almost all the editorial staff of these come to summer in Provincetown. Commentary, Dissent. Edmund Wilson called the 2 of them. They were left-wing Jewish magazines. He called them dysentery, Dissent and Commentary. Anyway, so it was a ton of writers. And of course, Norman Mailer wrote The Naked and the Dead in Provincetown, his very first book, and wrote almost everything else there too.
And a lot more, I guess we can discuss, Ike, to be continued. Thanks to all the great questions. And I think it's over to Margaret, and we're going to go from here. And thank you so much, Ike, for this great conversation and all the questions.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Elliot, thank you so much, Ike. And what a marvelous portrait you 2 have provided of places and people, America's artistic spirit, its political spirit. And thank you, Ike, for the American Inspiration Series, the literary spirit of Cape Cod, Outer Cape Cod. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration Series, we've asked both of our authors tonight to read from their books. So Elliot, let's start with you. Thank you.
Thank you. More than in any of the watercolors of houses painted that summer, the mansard roof expresses Hopper's Anglo-Saxon personality, as Pen de Bois described him, at his most unbuttoned, rendering an intimate expression of sunlight on the side of a house. In this instance, the house exhibits a magnificent pile of porches, dormers, and chimneys, lining a mansard roof that reaches nearly to the top of the sheet. At the center, awnings billow closely together in the wind, so that their lower edges graze one another, and we can easily imagine Hopper and Nivison sitting together on Rocky Neck, as she later designated their whereabouts that summer of 1923 inside the cover of the first record book. The importance of that place, where they were surrounded by the glistening water of Gloucester Harbor and enveloped by the summer atmosphere of Cape Ann, was clearly worthy of noting for posterity. The side-by-side awnings that respond to light and air carry our own spirits aloft as they billow under the warmth of the brilliant sunshine. The pointed dormers, interspersed with chimneys, shutters, and glimpses of the mansard roof for which the sheet is named, come together like the angled pipes of a circus calliope, blowing gusts of their happy tune as they jump up and down with joy toward the upper edge and beyond. A jaunt in their car to Gloucester's circus grounds at Stageford Park found Edward still working through the impact of the railroad and its dark red freight cars on life in Gloucester. In his watercolor of a circus wagon, the reddish freight car at the right is angled towards us, with the number 16 stenciled on the rear, featured prominently. At left, angled in the opposite direction, the artist paints a Model T Ford, also from the rear with its curved fenders and spare tire visible. Linking both forms of modern transport, one for circus acts and the other for those attending the performance, Hopper paints the upper edges of the two circus tents with a dingy pale ochre. Sliced off at the left, he includes a clapboard gazebo with small American flags visible in the distance between flanking pillars supporting the roof. By painting two vehicles and two American flags within what initially appears to be a modest scene of circus grounds, the artist links popular entertainment, integral to the fabric of everyday American life, with the sobering impact of modern transportation. At the same circus grounds, Joe Hopper paints the tents in a brighter color and distinguishes their shapes, one with a conical top and one pitched with a central gable. She also includes the bold striped yellow, red, and white side panels below the big tops and adds several small flags snapping cheerily in the breeze behind them. Instead of slicing off the gazebo as Edward does, Joe features the full structure as a counterpoint to her flanking circus tents. While Edward and Joe both paint the peaked granite boulders lining the road, Edward omits the lush trees that appear in Joe's composition, enlivening her sheet with calligraphic brushstrokes of pale and darker green to convey the lush foliage of summer. Thank you.
Elliot, that's lovely. Thank you so much for a portrait of this amazing couple and also of summertime. We so appreciate it. Ike, over to you for your reading.
They have all left us, those flawed, rowdy, careless bohemians who sought unreachable utopias where all men and all women were equals and where governments were constructed to provide equal access to education, health, and a rich cultural life. Like Jig Cook, he was the founder of the Provincetown Players, like Jig Cook, they envisioned an Athenian America, where its citizens engaged in intense public discourse, be it in writing, painting, or architecture, where its heroes were those who served as public intellectuals, disputing theories of what was best in full view of all its citizens. They would not have comprehended Fox News. They were appalled by America's use of military power for any purpose but defense. They opposed the toxin of, quote, big money, as John Dos Passos called it, which was transforming elections and legislation into battles to benefit either the rich or even the richer. Imagine the masses' editorials in the 2020 election. John Reed and Emma Goldman would once again be labeled terrorists. For them, the right of workers were paramount, regardless of whether that support branded them Marxists. They would be shocked that corporations now totally control the workplace and organized labor is unable to influence working conditions, wages, or benefits. That loyal workers are no longer can expect retirement payments while executives garner enormous bonuses, even during bad years, and that our allocation of wealth is now the most extreme in America's history, with 5% of the population having more wealth than the bottom 95%. For them, capitalism was a serpent in America's Garden of Eden. They believed its growing power in the new century had betrayed its workers, supported Jim Crow, demonized immigrants, particularly Jews, and denied women the vote or equal treatment. Those who challenged it were swiftly labeled Reds to suppress any rational political debate or new artistic vision. And yet, their lives and dreams flourished, for America still provided a fluid society in which an educated and uneducated miner's son, a young woman with no money, a Jewish intellectual, a Black actor or musician, or an immigrant painter or architect could succeed on grit and merit. They lived daring lives through 2 world wars, a depression, and the creation of a new America that they helped to shape. Ave atque vale.
Ike, how very inspiring. Thank you so much. The patriotism of intellectuals, this form of patriotism, is so very important too. Thank heaven for the free spirits, the arts, and for summer colonies. A reminder to our audience, we do have copies of both books, The Shores of Bohemia and Edward Hopper and Cape Ann, available from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. If you'd like your book signed by the authors, please input the code AMINS23 as you order from the bookstore. Special for this evening, as these authors, as I said, are hometown favorites, you can ask for your book to be personalized. Simply put the desired name or phrase in the comments field as you order from the store in the next 24 hours. A note about schedules from the bookstore: if these books come in quickly, which they might, they'll get mailed to you by August 16th. If not, because of vacations, the bookstore will have them out the door the last week of August. We thank you in advance for supporting independent bookstores in Ike's hometown, Cambridge, and across the river from me and others here at American Ancestors NEHGS. Now, I'd like to welcome on screen some of our esteemed partners for tonight's event who have some great information to share for you fellow arts aficionados. First, from the Cape Ann Museum, welcome, please, Director Oliver Barker. Oliver.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And I just wanted to share with our audiences tonight that for close to 150 years, the mission of the Cape Ann Museum has been to share the power of stories. Today, the museum is a vibrant cultural center that spans 2 distinct Gloucester, Massachusetts locations, featuring 4 historic structures, modern galleries, an art studio, and children's workshop spaces. The museum's extensive collections are curated to teach, to inspire, to forge connections, and to celebrate the inexhaustible human spirit that has animated this corner of the earth for centuries. We're delighted to partner in tonight's presentation and hope that you will all now join us here in the galleries to see Edward Hopper and Cape Ann, the exhibition that is on view through October the 16th.
And welcome also to Chris McCarthy, the CEO of the Provincetown Art Association and Museum. Chris, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a delight to listen to stories about both of our capes, and echoing what you heard a lot of tonight. Since the 1890s, artists have traveled to the farthest reaches of Cape Cod to bask in the light and get carried away by their own creativity and desire to learn. As the only art museum in Provincetown, PAM is the anchor of that history and the keeper of its traditions. Through collecting exhibitions and programs, PAM upholds the history of Provincetown, its place, and continues to educate students about its historical importance while providing a safe space for all contemporary artists to make their own marks on history. Honoring the legacy isn't only about protecting the past, it's about continually adding our own histories so the next generation will always feel compelled to take up the torch. It's about giving contemporary artists of all ages and backgrounds a voice, a place, a sense of belonging, and the freedom to create. It's about existence in a small community with a global reach and the delicate balance of honoring both year-rounders and seasonal visitors. It's that sense of connection, the past with the present, the local community with the global community, the teachers to the learners, that makes PAM what it is. It's a place for learning, appreciation, and discovery, situated on a tiny strip of land surrounded by water on 3 sides, which artists have been experimenting and discovering for over 120 years. Our greatest pride is being the keepers of that history and welcoming all new generations to become part of that legacy. So we hope that you'll come visit us in Provincetown. Good luck finding a hotel room right now, but we encourage you to come anyways. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this. Back to you, Margaret.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you both. It's been such a pleasure, this partnership. Back to tonight. Thank you, Ike, Oliver, Chris. We have all learned so much, and thanks to the GBH Forum Network, Andrew, Grace Lynn, and also Frederic on vacation, thank you for all you do behind the scenes. And to the audience out there in Zoom land, thank you. We appreciate your interest in America's history, its cultural trends, and its full diversity. We wish you all a happy summertime, good reading, and a very good night. Thank you for coming.